13. So nervous. Okay. When he could do it with that.
I have a hot mic too.
Oh, yeah, I would turn it off for now. Right. Well, good afternoon to everyone, unless you happen to be in Israel or elsewhere on the other side of the ocean where it would be good evening. And luckily, we did figure out the whole daylight savings time confusion, because it is not daylight savings time in Israel for another 3 weeks. So there is a very good chance that our very special guest could have been either an hour early or an hour late. That's math that's far too complicated for me. But we are very glad that Google and Dr. Barlavi helped us figure out what time it would be in both places today. This is just such a special opportunity for us, and always to be joined by Dr. Matt Tapie, from the St. Leo University Center for Catholic Jewish Studies. I should introduce myself, because in this joint program, especially many of the folks joining us via Zoom don't know me. I'm Rabbi Joel Simon. I am the senior rabbi at Congregation Schaarai Zedek. And when I first came to Tampa 18 years ago as assistant rabbi at the time, one of the first things I learned was how important our partnership with the center is. And the kind of program that we've been able to put together because of that partnership has always been a gift and always a blessing to both of our communities. I'm going to let Dr. Tapie officially introduce Yossi a little later, but well, first of all, and I've shared with many of you often, but whenever anything happens in the Jewish world, Dr. Tapie is always one of the first to reach out and offer thoughts and say that he and the center are here for us in our local community any way they can be. And of course, after October 7th, not only was Dr. Tapie one of the first to reach out, but it was an opportunity for us to get together, and I wanted to hear where he was, he wanted to hear where I was, we wanted to see what our communities could do in partnership. And the first thing I said to him is, you need to be listening to this podcast. It's called For Heaven's Sake, and it's where I turn to help me process what's going on in the world, how to understand it, how to live in this conflict between different opinions that exist in me. And Dr. Tapie said, I've been listening to For Heaven's Sake forever. And we learned that we had one more thing in common. And we said, wouldn't it be incredible if we could have some kind of program where we were able to bring in Yossi, and it took a couple years. But here we are. And Dr. Tapie, I'm just so grateful for your partnership in so many ways, and honored to be sharing this conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Joel. It's an honor and a joy to partner with you once again here in the community, as we have so many times before. I learned of Yossi and his work from Rabbi David Mayan, who was the inaugural Cone Chair in Jewish Thought at the St. Leo Center for Catholic Jewish Studies. But I do want to welcome everyone in person here, as well as those who are online. We have around 80 or so who are tuning in, and we're very glad that you are with us as well. Welcome to Israelis and Palestinians in the context of Catholic Jewish dialogue, understanding Israeli perspectives with Yossi Klein Halevi. The CCJS, for those of you who may not know and who are tuning in for the first time, is an academic center at St. Leo University in Florida. And for almost 30 years, its mission has been to build mutual understanding and respect between Catholics and Jews and all people of goodwill through interreligious education programs like this one. We have programs on campus and teach hundreds of students in classrooms. We have scholarly and research initiatives, but we're also in the community like we are today. And we are so grateful for our fruitful relationship working with Rabbi Simon, who is so talented and open and welcoming, and we couldn't ask for a better friend in the community. At the beginning of last year, our center began envisioning a series that would directly engage a topic we always discuss: Catholic-Jewish dialogue and relations. But we wanted to focus on how we as Catholics and Jews should discuss the difficult topic of relations between Israelis and Palestinians. What steps can Catholics and Jews take toward a fruitful conversation? Some of the questions that emerged: what is the meaning of the state of Israel today for Jews? Some Catholics may not know. What is the relationship of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? Should Catholic-Jewish relations engage this topic? And there are other questions as well. How can we create a dialogue where we can carefully listen to each other's story? Today's session is the third and final installment in our three-part series, and it focuses on Israeli perspectives by featuring our very special guest, the renowned writer and journalist, Yossi Klein Halevi. Allow me to introduce Yossi, who is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He is co-host, together with Donniel Hartman, of the Hartman Institute's For Heaven's Sake podcast, the #1 Jewish podcast in the English-speaking world. Halevi's 2013 book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year award. His latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, has appeared in 12 languages. He is currently writing a book about the meaning of Jewish survival. Halevi has written for leading op-ed pages in North America and is a former contributing editor to the New Republic. He is frequently quoted on Israeli, Middle Eastern, and Jewish affairs in leading media around the world. He co-directs the Hartman Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim leaders in North America about Judaism, Jewish identity in Israel. Over 150 Muslim leaders have participated in the unique program. Yossi, thank you for your work in interreligious dialogue. It was a joy to meet you in November in Israel, and thank you for being with us here today. I'll turn it over to you and Joel for the next few minutes. Joel, I believe that you had a few questions.
Well, you are also often quoted from this bima, because I really don't talk about Israel without sharing your and Donniel's perspectives and encouraging people to listen to the podcast. And again, you both have been my rabbis and teachers for many years, but especially since October 7th, and helping me figure out how to bring my thoughts to the congregation. Dr. Tapie gave us a little bit of introduction for you, but I think for folks who don't know you as well, especially as we're talking about dialogue of those with different opinions. You've lived in so many different opinions. And can you share with us how you moved from a Kahanist circle and maybe explaining what that is to the Hartman Institute, which maybe you'll also help share what that is and your progression in between?
Well, first of all, thank you both for really such a warm welcome. I feel embraced and I'm instantly part of your wonderful community, the community that the two of you have created together. And when you invited me to this forum, I was especially keen on participating because, as you both know, it's the relationship between Catholics and Jews over Israel has become increasingly strained, and I'm deeply grateful for the courageous work that you're both doing. So thank you for having me. So to your question, Joel, I grew up in a Holocaust survivor family, and we all of our origin stories begin with our families. In my case, my origin story really begins with the Holocaust. And my father was a very rare survivor in those days, in the sense that he spoke constantly about his experiences and about what had happened to the Jewish people. And I say that it was rare because in the early years after the Holocaust, survivors were either too stunned or simply didn't have the words to explain to their American children what had happened. And and survivors were keen on creating new lives and moving on. And there wasn't this tendency to dwell in the past. That came later for survivors. The outpouring of memoirs that we now have, or the survivors who speak in schools and the Holocaust museums that we know, this is all relatively a new phenomenon. And so my father, in that sense, was a kind of pioneer. And I grew up and as an extension of his experience, as really living his vicarious memories. And and so I grew up as a kind of a surrogate survivor, which was how he intended to raise me. He wanted me to understand that the Jews are vulnerable, that we live in a world where we're hated, and not to be naive. He was desperately afraid that his American children would be naive Americans who wouldn't be able um, to cope with anti-Semitism. And so, an unintended result of that education was that I was looking for some way to unpack all of this historical load that I was given by virtue of being born in this family. And I was looking for some place in the Jewish world that would reflect the intensity of my family experience. And in those years, American Jewry was very different. It was insecure. It was self-conscious. It wasn't sure at all of its place in American society. I'm speaking about the 1960s. It was just beginning to emerge into a new America and beginning to sense its changing place in American society. But there was still a great deal of self-consciousness. And Jews tended to keep their heads down. And I remember when the grown-ups in my world would say the word Jew in public, they would whisper it. The voices would lower. And I used to call that the American Jewish whisper. And Meir Kahane, radical Rabbi Firebrand, who later moved to Israel and became the leader of the far right in Israel, the racist far right, and was assassinated in 1990. Uh, Meir Kahane created an organization in 1968 called the Jewish Defense League, which took all of this Holocaust rage that I had no way to express and gave it voice. And I joined with Meir Kahane. I joined the Jewish Defense League, and it was a paramilitary organization. We learned to shoot. We functioned as a kind of a Jewish militia, and we would patrol Jewish neighborhoods where Jews were being attacked in the streets to protect Jewish communities. We were especially active against the Soviet Union. This was the time of the Soviet Jewry movement, and we were the violent wing of the Soviet Jewry movement, fighting the police in the streets, breaking up Soviet concerts, and and more acts of even greater violence. And I was 17, 18 at the time, and it was also the late 1960s, and the JDL portrayed itself as the Jewish version of the Black Panthers or SDS, the Students for Democratic Society. And so it was also part of a generational cultural shift. And in that sense, the JDL was a kind of convergence point for the post-Holocaust generation's frustration and anger at the world, and the American 60s. And Kahane managed to embody that very strange convergence. I left the JDL around the time when Kahane moved to Israel and shifted the emphasis from defending vulnerable Jews to becoming an anti-Arab racist uh, demagogue. And I saw the transition happening up close. And my friends and I said, this is not what we signed up for, and we left. So breaking with Kahane in around, I was about 20 when that 21 when that happened. That was the beginning of my journey to which ended in the Hartman Institute, which is Israel's preeminent center for Jewish pluralistic education, for interfaith work, and bringing the something of the democratic and pluralistic sensibilities of its American Jewish founders. The Institute was really founded by American immigrants, Rabbi David Hartman in particular. And and so it's a very long story. I actually, it's the topic of my first book called Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist. All the different torturous stages along the way of how I went from seeing the whole world as anti-Semitic and my enemy to beginning to realize that the world was a lot more of a complicated place than I thought, or that my father's experience would have indicated. And so it was also, in a sense, breaking away from the education that I received from my father and finding my own relationship to my Jewish identity and a different way of relating to the Holocaust. And I'll say one final point, if I may, which is that what what really, in some way, embodies the shift in consciousness, because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about an inner transformation. For me, was gradually realizing that my father's generation was really the least fortunate generation of Jews in history. And my generation was the most fortunate in Jewish history. I grew up in America of the 1960s and 70s, the most accepting diaspora in Jewish history, with a Jewish state there for the taking. And as I told my children as they were growing up, You kids are privileged to have the two best passports in Jewish history. You're Israelis and you're Americans, and it just in 4,000 years of Jewish history, it did not get any better than that. And so my final transition was realizing that I needed to own my generation's experience of of living in a transformed world. And and that's not to say living in a perfect world. It's not to say living in a world uh, where anti-Semitism doesn't periodically recur and now recurring with great intensity. But that doesn't negate the understanding that we are that we are still a blessed generation, and it's not the 1930s anymore.
Thank you so much for taking us on that journey with you. And, if one of the goals of dialogue is trying to understand why someone might have different perspective than you do, you model that so well for us. And I think such a big part of that is from your experience, but even many people with diverse experiences still don't bring that understanding. So thank you
Well,
for
thank you,
modeling that
Joel.
for us.
I often feel as if I'm having an ongoing interfaith dialogue with myself, or the different parts of myself that I'm trying somehow to reconcile. So,
Some of the best conversations are with ourselves. It's just whether we let others in. Um, so we've planned this conversation for a while, and what is interfaith dialogue post October 7th? What is interfaith dialogue post October 7th? But then things changed a little bit a week ago. I emailed Yossi Sunday morning, a week ago from right now, and I said, of course, our assumption is that we're going to be postponing this conversation. We want you to take care of yourself and take care of your family. And in such an Israeli way, Yossi wrote back, why would we postpone? I'm in if you guys are. But we do want to take a moment to recognize this moment. So, Yossi, can you, first of all, share with us where you are right now and why you are where you are, and how we as a mostly American community can understand what's happening in Israel right now?
so at the moment, I'm sitting in the safe room in my apartment, and every Israeli apartment that's been built, say, in the last 20 years or so, um, by regulation, must have a safe room, which is reasonably secure from missile attack, provided it's not a direct attack. If it's a direct attack on the safe room, then there is there's no protection. But we feel generally safe when we lock the iron door behind us, and it's it's become a kind of routine for us, and this is very hard, I think, for people outside of Israel to understand what it means living with existential threat as a permanent part of reality. And by existential threat, I mean on two levels. There's the collective level, the threat to the existence of Israel, and there's the personal threat. And we've been living in and out of shelters in this country really since the early 90s, since the first Gulf War with Saddam Hussein. And that was our first experience with running into safe rooms. Those Israelis who don't have a safe room in their apartments, and that's at least a third of the population, have to make do with public shelters, which can be underground garages or shelters in apartment buildings. And so my wife Sarah and I go for a walk during the day, we're always keeping an eye out to see where the nearby shelters might be that we'd need to take refuge in if there's a siren. I should say that if there is going to be a siren, we'll be able to continue the conversation because I'm in the safe room.
So we're at war. America and Israel together attacked Iran last Saturday evening. You shared in the most recent podcast, and I don't know the source of the poll, but I think you said 92% of Jewish Israelis are in favor of this war. And that's not necessarily the world we're facing right now. So again, without fully shifting the goals of our program, but also wanting to take advantage of your being with us, can you share your perspective right now? You have personally been talking about this issue for a long, long time. So how are you viewing what's happening right now? And maybe to give us a little bit of optimism, what would your best case scenario coming out of this be? Not necessarily victory, but what does success look like?
Oh, the poll is extraordinary, and certainly in my own personal experience, that's borne out. I don't know anyone who is in Israel who is opposed to this war. And that level of near unanimity is virtually non-existent in Israeli discourse. So there's such a deep sense of disconnect between Israel and much of the rest of the world, where this war is extremely controversial and unpopular, and is taken for granted among Israelis. I should say, again, Israeli Jews, as you noted, because Israeli Arabs are much less in favor. I think the figure is about 25% of Israeli Arabs support the war, which itself is actually, quite surprising. For that community, that's a very high percentage to support Israel at war. So the reason that Israelis feel this way, Israeli Jews are so unanimous. And again, bear in mind that many of us feel about Netanyahu and his government the way many of you feel about your president and your government. And which is to say, we have no trust in this government. I regard this government as um, as a danger to Israeli well-being, a very serious threat. And yet, and I've spent much of the last few years in the streets demonstrating against this government. And still, when it comes to this war, we've suspended our criticism, our skepticism, and we've lined up behind the government that we detest for the greater good, because we believe that this is a war that's unavoidable. And Israel has been at war with Iran since 1979. Iran declared war against the great Satan, which was America, and the little Satan, which is Israel. And the war between Iran and America has been sporadic, sometimes abstract. There has been nothing abstract or sporadic in Iran's war with Israel. Iran succeeded in surrounding Israel on almost every border with its terror proxies. And the war that began on October 7th was not principally the Israeli-Hamas war, even though that's the perception in the world. The war with Hamas was only one front And Israel didn't experience the war as primarily the Gaza war. This was a war with roving fronts from Gaza to Lebanon to Syria to Iraq to Yemen and ultimately to Iran. And so the war that began on October 7th really was the Israeli-Iranian war, which is now playing out in its final stages. And there are, from an Israeli perspective, there is a compelling strategic argument for this war and a moral argument. The strategic argument is that Iran is not only the center of the efforts to destroy Israel. Iran has declared, the Iranian regime has declared the existence of Israel a theological affront, and in the apocalyptic theology that it has developed under its first leader Khomeini, and then carried on by Khamenei. Israel plays a very key role in the apocalyptic scenario. The Mahdi, the Shiite Messiah, comes back and destroys the Jewish people. That is key to how this strain of Shiite theology sees its war against Israel, and so it sees it in clearly messianic terms. But the war against Iran is also against the region's greatest threat. Iran set as its goal the domination of the Middle East. It succeeded in controlling, directly or indirectly, at least 4 Arab countries: Iraq, Lebanon, Syria in its day, and Libya. And every one of those countries was ravaged by the Iranian occupation. And so the war against Iran is also a war for a region that can begin to see a different future for itself. And the alliance that's emerging between Israel, the Gulf states, hopefully the Saudis, and other Arab countries to contain the Iranian threat, I think offers great hope for the future. The moral argument here is that, we've just been through a brutal 2 years of war in Gaza, which, as we all know, galvanized much outrage around the world. The cause of Gaza became the preeminent political movement among young people in the West. And that war had terrible consequences. Probably 40,000 civilians out of the 70,000 who were killed. 40,000 were civilians out of the casualties in Gaza. Those 40,000 casualties, we can discuss the war in Gaza, and we probably should. I feel that it is a war that was unavoidable, and I also feel that in some ways the war got out of control. But in 2 years of brutal combat against terrorists who were embedded in a civilian population with hundreds of kilometers of tunnels and thousands of booby-trapped homes, the same number of civilian casualties that were killed in 2 years of fighting in Gaza were killed by the Iranian regime in a few days in January, 30 to 40,000 civilians. And I'm astonished but not surprised that those same people who are out on the streets, sometimes every week, demonstrating for the people in Gaza, were completely silent about the slaughter in Iran. And now that we are attacking the regime, Suddenly, we're hearing progressive voices expressing their solidarity with the Iranian people and President Obama, for example, who didn't have a word to say in January about the tens of thousands of casualties in Iran, now says his heart is with the innocent casualties in Iran. Well, I spend a lot of time on Iranian social media, following the dissident community and the contempt that they have for the silence of the progressives is really sobering. And so the moral argument here is that this is also a war to not only free Israel from existential threat, not only a war to free the Middle East from the imperial ambitions of Iran. This is also a war to free the Iranian people. And one last comment about the progressives and the progressive anti-Zionists is that their moral critique, from my point of view, has been fundamentally discredited. I don't feel in any way morally accountable to people who were silent during the mass slaughter in Iran.
And we'll come back to that for sure. I do want to point out, Yossi, on his Facebook page on Sunday, I believe, posted a picture of his balcony with a picture with the Israeli flag hanging next to the Iranian flag. And was that common throughout Israel, or was that a Yossi special?
It was actually my wife. It was Sarah who ordered this was the pre-Islamic Iranian flag with the lion and the sword, a very dramatic flag. And Sarah said, when the war begins, we're going to hang these two flags up. So I haven't seen others around, but Iran and the Iranian cause is very close to people's hearts here. And one of the most extraordinary things that we've seen, and Joel, I don't know if you've been following this, but all around the Iranian diaspora, there's been an outpouring in the streets, mass demonstrations, and there are three flags that are flying at these demonstrations. It's the pre-Islamic revolutionary Iranian flag, it's the American flag, and the Israeli flag. And there's something so moving to me to see Iranians of all people. This is Israel's greatest strategic enemy, and yet the people of Iran, there's this outpouring of sympathy and solidarity with Israel. And what this war has done, I think, for many of us, is remind us that Israel has been on the right side of history. And whether everything that happened in this war should have happened or not over the last 2 years, and that's an important question that the Jewish community needs to ask itself. What went right and what went wrong in the last 2 years? Still, I think that in the aggregate, what the last few months have shown us is that the war against radical Islamism uh, is unavoidable, and those who are fighting it are doing a really a great favor to the world, whether that's acknowledged or not.
Thank you very much, Yossi, for your comments. The next question is, can you share about the meaning of Israel for Jews today? As you know, the Vatican teaches, or as you may know, the Vatican teaches Catholics to strive to understand how Jews define themselves. And so Catholics have this in their mindset. Perhaps recommend a few resources for Catholics who want to study and learn about the history and complexity of Israeli society.
Well, I appreciate the question. I should say, that we're in the 60th year of Nostra Aetate, which began the most extraordinary process of self-examination and atonement that any religion ever undertook in its relationship to another faith. And I think that that's something that the Jewish community needs to internalize deeply, because this is something that, the advances we've seen in 6 decades in Catholic Jewish relations, something we didn't see for the entire 2,000 years that preceded it. And so this is we really live in extraordinary times, and it's all the more reason why we need to do everything we can to protect this precious legacy that we've inherited from the last generation. The what makes the what makes it so difficult for outsiders to understand Jews is that Judaism doesn't operate quite the same way as the other monotheistic faiths. In fact, we can't even agree among ourselves what we are. Are we a religion? Are we a people? Are we an ethnicity? Are we a nation? And my definition, which I think is the definition of the Jewish mainstream, is that we are a people with a particular religious faith. And that helps explain the strange anomaly of the Jewish atheist. In other faiths, when you opt out, when you stop believing in the theology, when you no longer practice, when you no longer consider yourself in any way a believer, you're pretty much out of the faith. It doesn't work that way in Judaism. And you could be an atheist and still be a member in reasonably good standing within the Jewish community. And the reason for that is that the foundation of Jewish identity is peoplehood. And it is a people with a very strange history in its relationship to a land. We centralize the land of Israel in our religious identity, certainly in our national identity. Our holidays are mostly expressions of the agricultural cycle of the land of Israel, so that wherever Jews live, we're always in sync with the agricultural rhythms of the land of Israel. We pray for rain regardless of where we are when it's the rainy season in the land of Israel, for example, and so on. And so the strangeness, though, of the Jewish relationship to the land of Israel is that while we have centralized the land in our identity and in our religious practice, Jews have lived outside the land for most of our history. A majority of the Jewish people for 4,000 years did not actually live in the land. Even in ancient times, when there was a sovereign Jewish state, you had a very large voluntary diaspora all over the Middle East, from Egypt to Iraq, what is now Iraq, Babylon, as we have today. We have a homeland and we have a very large diaspora. The Jewish people today is almost evenly divided between the state of Israel and the diaspora. The state of Israel is home to the world's largest Jewish community, which is really the great success of Zionism. Because when we started out in 1948, there were 600,000 Jews. Today, Israel's population is 10 million. And so we have a very kind of unsettled relationship to our identity. It's very fluid, peoplehood, religion, ethnicity. We have a very fluid relationship between land and diaspora. But you can't understand the Jewish people without understanding the interplay between homeland and diaspora, which is really at the core of our identity and our practical lives, our history. One last point here is that for the 2,000 years when the Jewish people was in exile, and I define exile as the condition of enforced involuntary separation from the homeland. The moment you have a Jewish state, then Jews who live outside of Israel are no longer in exile. They are in a condition of voluntary diaspora, because anyone could just get on a plane, as I did as a young American Jew in 1982. I got on a plane at Kennedy Airport and flew to Israel and said, I'm home and I'd like to make it official. And Jews who don't take that step have a connection to Israel, but it's a different kind of connection. And so we are living at a time when it's no longer the land of Israel that is central in Jewish imagination the way it was for 2,000 years of exile. Today, the abstract land of Israel has become the concrete state of Israel. And the state of Israel is now the practical center of Jewish life for Jews around the world. Israel, as I've said earlier, is the largest Jewish community. It's also the repository of the most vibrant form of collective Jewish life, because we are in control of our own sovereign space. And so it's the only place in the world where the Hebrew calendar is the normative calendar. And so this creates a concretization of what was for 2,000 years of exile an abstraction and a longing.
Thank you very much, Yossi.
And always to be put on the spot to explain what Jews think about anything. The first thing to explain is again, we can't agree with each other, we can't agree with ourselves. So, but that was really a wonderful attempt. Thank you. And I think also to understand dialogue concerning Israel and Israel itself is recognizing that conversations about Zionism and Israel change in moments. And the conversation before the Holocaust was different than the conversation after the Holocaust, pre-1948, post-1948, pre-Six-Day War, post-Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War. And surely October 7th is our most recent moment that changed dialogue concerning Israel. So can you tell us a little bit where we were before October 7th, what October 7th did to that conversation, and maybe a little bit about where we are now?
So the period before October 7th was an extended stretch that I would call the post-Holocaust era. And the post-Holocaust era was a time of remarkable Jewish renewal. We went from the lowest point in Jewish history, which was 1945, to the peak moment of Jewish power, ability to defend ourselves, centrality on the world stage, significance in the world conversation in a way that we have never been before. And we made this transition from the absolute lowest point in our history. And we did it in a single generation. And I know of no example of any people that managed that. It is the single greatest achievement of survival in Jewish history. And that period, the 75 years or so between 1945 and October 7th, 2023, 80 years, whatever exactly it is, that period came to an end on October 7th. And what happened on October 7th was the return of acute Jewish vulnerability and a sense of aloneness in the world. For a few days after October 7th, or a few weeks, we had support and understanding, sympathy, but that very quickly evaporated as the Gaza war intensified. And we went from being perceived as victims, of October 7th, to being victimizers. And we are now in this loop between victim and victimizer. And neither of those identities seem to me useful in understanding Israel. We're not victims. And even on October 7th, we weren't victims. We had a momentary lapse in our ability to protect ourselves, which lasted all of one day. And it was a terrible day. It was the worst day in the history of the state of Israel. But we very quickly recovered and went on the offensive and made a decision to uproot the Hamas regime that had done that to the Jewish people. And however one sees the war in Gaza, it was not an attempt to destroy the Palestinian people. It was an attempt, not successful in the end, to destroy Hamas, to destroy the Hamas regime. And the dynamic that we're now in, where so many Jews see ourselves as once again victims, we're facing anti-Semitism on a global level, and thanks to social media, we've never experienced anti-Semitism to this extent of simultaneity the way we are now. Anti-Semitism is everywhere. And that really is because of the nature of this time that we're in, because of the ability to spread these ideas. And so, on the one hand, Jews understandably feel that we're under assault as we've never been before, certainly since the 40s, but in some sense, at least again, in the global sense, this is unprecedented. But at the same time, when you look at the ruins of Gaza, you can't say that we're victims. And again, I believe that we basically had no choice but to fight this war against radical Islamism. And maybe the results could have been tempered to some extent, but not fundamentally. And so I own the war, and I own its terrible consequences. I've defended this war, and I have to live with that. But what that really means is that I can't own the identity of victim. And this is very difficult for many Jews, because in the past, when we would be accused of using the blood of children for matzah, Jews knew that was a ludicrous accusation. And we at least had the self-confidence and the dignity of our innocence. Today, after 2 years of Gaza, we're not innocent anymore. I don't believe that we're Nazis. I don't believe we're guilty of genocide, but we're not innocent. You can't wield power to the extent that we have, necessarily, but nevertheless, you can't wield that level of power and still be victims. And so we're in this very strange moment in Jewish history, where on the one hand, we feel once again that we're victims. We're being attacked on every side. The wildest conspiracy theories are becoming normative from the left, the right, from the Muslim community. And, you know, when there's an anti-Semitic attack, the first question that I ask myself is, who did it? Was it when there's a swastika painted on a synagogue, we don't know whether it's a right-wing swastika celebrating Nazism, or whether it's a left-wing swastika accusing us of being Nazis. But it's still the same swastika being painted on a synagogue. And so we're in that moment, but we don't have the same sense of our innocence, which helped get us through in the past. And it's a very strange moment for the Jewish people.
And that strange moment leads often to difficult conversations. And again, sitting with Dr. Tapie in conversation is always so easy, but it's not always that way. And whether it's within the Jewish community, with our interfaith partners or friends, neighbors, and while I can't speak to it, outside the Jewish community, I'm sure having conversations with friends and neighbors as well, those conversations are hard. A joy of joint programming is we have lots of different titles and can even give those titles to our different communities. And at one point I called this conversation, Keeping Conversation Regarding Israel Holy. And what does it mean for conversation to be holy? And your podcast, which I always recommend, and hopefully everyone has hit that subscribe button on your podcast app of choice, but it's called For Heaven's Sake. And not everyone of our attendees or participants today may understand where that comes from. So could you explain the concept of L'Shem Shamayim, what it means to you as you approach difficult conversations with those who may not always agree with you, how it plays out on the podcast, and how it plays out with those with whom you have more differences than you do with Donniel. And for those who haven't learned, Donniel and Yossi represent two different perspectives who can seem far apart, but really, in the grand scheme of things, are probably closer together than most of the people with whom you speak.
Yeah, right. That's right. That's really true. In Jewish traditional text learning, you have a study partner. It's called a chavruta, your friend, your study friend. And the way that chavruta study works is you argue with each other, but you're arguing for the sake of heaven. You're arguing to understand the word of God and how that applies to your life. And Donniel and I have tried to take that model and apply it to our political conversations. And what does it mean for two friends to sit down who very often disagree, maybe more about nuances than substance? And that's probably partly why our conversations work, is, as you noted, the differences between us are not as great in this cultural moment as perhaps they once would have been. And but still, we have enough disagreement to sustain a weekly podcast, and we're able to do that because of the sense of shared purpose. We are part of the same project, which is the enhancement of the Jewish people, and through the Jewish people as a way of enhancing humanity. And Donniel and I have different emphases, different priorities. I'd say that's really the source of our disagreement most often. Donniel's primary commitment is to the moral health of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. My primary commitment is to the physical well-being of the Jewish people. And that comes from each of our backgrounds. Donniel is the son of one of the great Jewish philosophers of our time, David Hartman, and I'm the son of a survivor. And so we approach these questions from very different sensibilities. But the reason that our conversations work is that what is the primary commitment for each of us is the second commitment for the other. In other words, security, the safety of the Jewish people is I approach every question, every issue with the first question is how will this keep us safe? And my second question is how do we do it morally? Donniel's first question is how do we ensure the moral integrity of the Jewish people? And then, well, how does this play into our need for security? And you know, these disagreements are not absolute. There are times when I feel that the moral urgency of a given issue takes primacy over even over security questions. And there are times when Donniel agrees with me that this is a time for the moment to prioritize security over moral consideration. And so that's how our conversation plays out. And I don't know how we would do if we didn't share the same basic commitment to the well-being of the Jewish people and the state of Israel, and if we both didn't have this commitment to seeing the Jewish story as part of the human story. It doesn't happen in isolation. And sometimes, you know, when you've been a ghettoized and persecuted people for so long, you kind of internalize that separatism. And and Donniel and I are both very committed to helping the Jewish people emerge from the psychological ghetto that we've been in. And what makes this time so difficult, the post October 7th time, is that Jews feel so alone, so misunderstood, so under attack that many of us are reverting back to the psychological ghetto. And I find that very dangerous, most of all for the Jewish people.
Thank you, Yossi. Your engagement with Donniel on the For Heaven's Sake podcast is a wonderful example of the sort of open conversations on disagreement that you foster. Some may not realize, and I hope you don't mind, Yossi, that I brought your books, or if at least two of them.
A writer never minds.
I didn't think you would.
The only complaint is where are the other ones? So,
that's a good point.
but thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
In Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, Yossi has really exemplified an openness that is remarkable. And I'm not about to read it to you, but I did want to highlight a note to the reader at the beginning. He says, I invite my Palestinians, as well as others throughout the Arab and Muslim world, to write to me. In his previous book, he wrote, I take a journey. It was an attempt to understand something of the faith and experiences of my neighbors, my Muslim and Christian neighbors. So he engages his Muslim and Christian neighbors in an entrance at the entrance to the Garden of Eden. And then in his Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, there's this concern for the others and the neighbor that I think is so interesting and aligns so well with our work at the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies, Yossi. And on the topic of disagreement and difference between Catholics and Jews, one of the differences might be that on the one hand, the concern for Palestinians, I think, is strong among many Catholics. Yet at the same time, there also is this recognition from the Vatican in 1993 that the State of Israel it has been recognized by the Vatican in its fundamental accord, though I know that journey was a difficult journey. And yet in 2015, there was a recognition of the Palestinian state in theory in 2015. Can you share why this might be difficult for some Israelis. I think for Catholics, they hear of these things and they think, you know, you're reading Vatican news. There's a daily Vatican newsletter that comes out that gives you information about different things in Vatican and foreign policy and relations all throughout the world. This would be one item that you might see. Why would it be for Israelis a difficult topic?
Well, I'll speak personally about what's the difficulties I've had about the Vatican position on the conflict over the years. Is that I've had the feeling, with some exceptions, Pope John Paul was a major exception, as was Pope Benedict, where I did feel that Israeli concerns were taken seriously. I feel that less in recent years, and my expectation is not for the Vatican to be pro-Israel at the expense of the Palestinians. I'm hoping for a Vatican position that has its heart open to both peoples and that's listening to the concerns of both peoples, that is trying to understand the positions of both peoples. And I have no right to ask for more than that, but I don't always feel that I'm getting that. I don't have the right to ask for more than that, but I also feel I can't expect less than that. I need to be heard, not agreed with, but I need my concerns to be heard in the Vatican, in the Catholic world. And to hear the Israeli position, how do we understand how we got to this point? How does someone like me, for example, who has advocated for a two-state solution for years, how do I justify, and I do, Israel's war? How do I accept? How do I live with the fact that that we're occupying another people? And I hate the occupation, but I also see it as unavoidable at this point, given our experience with the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian national movement, which has not come to terms with the right of Israel to exist, quite the opposite. And so I would hope that Catholics would listen to and try to understand the position of liberal Israelis who want justice, who want to free both peoples from the occupation, because Israel is also, in some sense, being occupied by this terrible situation. This is a tremendous moral burden on the Jewish people, and I want us to be freed from that burden. But I also want our friends to at least listen to us and try to understand why we feel the way we do, and then draw your own conclusions. Listen to the Palestinian side, listen to the Israeli side. And you know, friends don't necessarily need to agree with each other on every point, but friends do need to trust the basic moral integrity of the other. And I don't always feel that my moral integrity as an Israeli is being respected.
Thank you, Yossi.
So perhaps to have this conversation, right, to have someone with shared values, whatever middle may mean, to be able to have that conversation from somewhere in the middle. But is machloket l'shem shamayim, is this argument for the sake of heaven possible with those who fall more in the extremes, and especially within the Jewish world, when there are those for whom expressing any concern for any Palestinian makes you anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, or on the other hand, were to say, you know, it's okay that you're Jewish, but to be accepted into this group, you have to give up any support or any connection to Israel. many families have loved ones on either side of that conversation and relationships that have really been severed over the last 2.5 years. So what is machloket l'shem shamayim? What is conversation for heaven's sake in those cases, and what kind of repair perhaps is possible moving forward?
So to really speak about the internal Jewish discourse, or the dysfunctional, the increasingly dysfunctional Jewish discourse, we are experiencing threats from internally, from two directions, and you touched on both of them. On the one hand, there's a growing far-right tendency among some Jews, a tendency toward anti-democracy, especially in Israel, toward rejecting sometimes even the basic humanity of the other side. And then on the other extreme in the Jewish community, you have growing anti-Zionism, which rejects the legitimacy of a Jewish state. So the entwinement of Israel's two foundational identities as a Jewish state and a democratic state are being torn apart by our two extremes. And any healthy community needs to do two things. It needs to be as broad and welcoming as possible, needs to be a big tent, but it also needs to have red lines, or to use the tent metaphor, it needs flaps. The tent needs flaps. And there is a tendency in some parts of the Jewish community to draw those red lines far more tightly than they should be. And for me, the red lines are very, very broad. And anyone who, within the Jewish community, who upholds Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is part of the very broad mainstream, regardless of how you play that out. But I can't make common cause with someone who doesn't believe that Israel should exist. We're not part of the same project. We're not part of the same commitment. We don't have the same future. And now we need to really be careful about, even in this, with this red line, we need to be careful on how we apply it. So for example, synagogues should be spaces without flaps. Anyone who comes to pray should be welcome in God's house, and let God sort out whose prayers he favors and whose prayers he might have trouble with. That's not for us to do. And I think that's the intuition of most rabbis. If you show up to the synagogue, then you belong. But I do think we need to draw these very careful distinctions, these red lines around anti-Zionism and around the outbreak of Jewish fascism that we've been seeing in some parts of the Israeli right. We need to draw very, very clear lines in our political institutions, in our communal institutions. And there, anti-Zionism has absolutely no place, and anti-Zionists have no right to positions of leadership.
So pretty much we're going no fascists either way.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yes. I
Yes,
think that works.
I think there is a left-wing fascism and a right-wing fascism. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yossi, thank you so much for your time. We're drawing near now to the end of our program, and so we thought we would end with a question that might focus on the work that we do in common, interreligious activity, dialogue, reaching out to people who are different, neighbors from different groups, and trying to create listening sessions, perhaps. Can you share with us a little bit about your work at the Hartman Institute and successful interfaith initiatives that you've undertaken, and perhaps hopefully we can work together in Israel or here in the United States in the future. I'll add that as well.
Well, I would like that very much. That would be an honor and a privilege. So, in terms of the work that we've done over the years, I've been involved in Muslim-Jewish dialogue very, very deeply on different levels: Palestinians and Israelis, Arab Israelis, Jewish Israelis, and deep work with the American Muslim community. And each of these dialogues have fared uh, differently. The long-term results are very mixed. In terms of the Palestinian-Israeli dialogue, in my case, uh, many of the relationships that I had before October 7th have not been sustained. I don't know if they are retrievable, but certainly the few relationships that have survived October 7th are all the more precious to me. And I understand why some of my former Palestinian partners felt so angry at me. I was supporting this terrible war, and it was a terrible war. I felt it was unavoidable, but I understand why they saw this very differently. And in terms of the relationship with Arab Israelis, fellow citizens who are Muslim or Christian Arabs, uh, that those relationships have more or less endured. And at the Hartman Institute, in the last few years, we've really worked on developing those relationships as a core part of our commitment. We've opened up the Fellows Program to Arab scholars to an extent that we never did before. There were always a few Arab Israeli scholars at the Institute, but now there's a very significant presence. We have a program to train future Arab Israeli leaders in Israeli citizenship and in advocacy for their community. A very successful experiment. We have a program where we bring high school principals from both Arab schools and Jewish schools together to study the religious texts of all three faiths. And so we're operating within Israeli society. We're operating on multiple levels with varying degrees of success. The program that we ran with the Muslim community in the United States did not survive October 7th. And that's a long story in itself. I think you mentioned in your introduction that we graduated something like 170 young emerging Muslim American leaders from the program, which was really a tremendous accomplishment given the deep antagonism within the Muslim community to the program. They really tried to stop it. And they didn't succeed. The opponents of the program failed to stop it, but October 7th succeeded in stopping it. And I hope I hope we'll be able to retrieve something of the very hard and deep work that we did for almost 10 years together with our Muslim partners. I hope that work is recoverable and that it still exists as a model for what's possible. Where my attention and the attention of some of the other people running the program has increasingly gone to in the last few years is toward the Arab world, the Middle East. And the irony is when we began this program at Hartman for Muslim American young leaders, our assumption was that America is one of the few places where Muslims and Jews can model normal, even intimate relationships, and that we could then try to bring that model to the Middle East. But the way things are looking now with the Abraham Accords and the possibility of expanding the Accords so that the Saudis come in, and if the Saudis come into the Abraham Accords, we're looking at the beginning of the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. There still will be the Palestinian conflict to resolve. But the 80-year war of the Sunni world against the Jewish state will be coming to an end, which is an extraordinary and very enticing possibility. But there are all kinds of openings that I see in a post-Iran war Middle East. And I'm hoping that some of what we've learned at Hartman over the years in teaching Judaism and Israel to Muslims could be useful in helping deepen these tentative relationships that are just opening up now between Israel and the Arab world. So that makes me, I suppose, in the current context, makes me an optimist.
Well, that's a remarkable statement. And at the beginning of our time together, I asked, what success might look like in this current war. And the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict sounds like a pretty remarkable success if that's where we're able to end up. So I love that sense of optimism to bring our conversation to a close. And, we were hoping to have time for Q&A, and I hope everyone will trust that Dr. Tapie and I and Yossi really thought through the flow of today's conversation. But I think in light of the shared values that we have, this idea of machloket l'shem shamayim, of argument, conversation for the sake of heaven, I think our hope is that Q&A happens at home, and Q&A happens at your dining room tables and in your text messages and wherever you have conversation, and that these conversations make their way into your families, into your relationships, and surely into our continued relationship between the center, our congregation, our communities. And God willing, Yossi, this conversation continues with you at some point again in Tampa. We would love to have you here.
Thank you. I look forward to that. Thank you.
Would everyone join me in thanking Yossi for his time?
Can you hear that?
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Yossi. And we thank everyone online as well as for tuning in. And you can always write to the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies with questions or comments. And we look forward to seeing you in future programming. Everyone, please have a lovely day or evening, depending upon where you are.
Matt and Joel, really, thank you both for your graciousness.
Thank you.
Yossi.